Our first presenter in this stream is Rocco. That Riley is the Queensland Partnerships Manager of Outbacks to Oceans for the Pew Charitable Trusts. And take it away, Riley.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm here today on behalf of the Pew Charitable Trusts, and I'm going to be talking about private land conservation in the Australian rangelands. So I'm hoping today to be able to demonstrate to you that conservation on private land will not only provide durable protection for our rangeland nature, but can also benefit private landholders as well. So the Pew Charitable Trust has been working for the last 15 years, and a large part of that work has been with First Nations groups, with Aboriginal groups for Indigenous protected areas and more ranges. And more recently, we are working more with partnering with pastoralists and looking at private land conservation. So today I'm going to go through private land conservation with you, and I'm going to use Queensland's Private Protected Area program as an example to demonstrate how landholders through this program can really demonstrate that they can lead the way in terms of getting good nature protection for our rangeland landscapes. So one of the questions might be that what is Pew Charitable Trust, which is a US-based global NGO interested in the Australian outback? And the answer to that is that the Australian outback, or the rangelands, are one of the few remaining places on the planet that have large, vast, intact landscapes of nature. So it's really incumbent on all of us to make sure we look after them. Now, the Australian continent, over 70% is pastoral tenure, pastoral leasehold land. And you can see on the map on the right, that's the Australia's reserve system, or our protected areas. That's things like national parks, Indigenous protected areas, and private protected areas. And you can see a lot of the gaps in that reserve system do overlay roughly with where the pastoral leasehold tenure is. So that means that there's ecosystems that are underrepresented in the protected area system. That's not to say, however, that these landscapes are not being looked after. There are amazing conservation values that exist on pastoral leasehold land. Pastoral leasehold land is home to a great portion of our great savannas, grasslands, arid ecosystems, desert wetlands, hundreds of endemic, rare, threatened species. It's truly valuable from a conservation perspective, and this is a credit to the good land stewardship that has been multi-generation pastoralists looking after the country well. However, without a system of protection, these landscapes are vulnerable to future land management changes or land use changes, whether that be change in management and overgrazing, whether it be a completely new land use or broad scale land clearing. There's still large areas that have no permanent protection, so we can make sure that those natural areas and those vulnerable species are well looked after. There's also the persistent kind of ongoing threats that we're all probably very familiar with in the rangelands. Things like feral animals, inappropriate fire regimes, weeds. These are ongoing management concerns for landholders and for nature, and they require active land management. And what that means, it really requires boots on the ground. It requires people there who are actively managing the landscape. So that raises the question, how can we best protect our rangelands landscapes, and how do we do that in a way that makes sure they're adequately managed, and where appropriate, how can we restore some of our pastoral landscapes? So the best people to be making sure we're looking after these landscapes are the people who are already there, whether that be First Nation groups living on country or pastoralists. They're uniquely in the position who know the country and are able to actively manage those threats. So we see a conservation outcome that supports people to stay on the land and be actively managing it for their own benefit and livelihood, as well as looking after the nature there as the best possible outcome. So this brings us to private land conservation. Conservation on private land involves private landholders that voluntarily enter into agreements that may be long-term or permanent, and the agreement is that they will maintain the conservation values that are on their land. It may include excluding cattle from certain areas and managing that area purely for conservation. In some cases, it's appropriate to still allow low impact cattle grazing in conservation areas, as long as those conservation areas are not detrimented by that activity. And often private land conservation opens up opportunities, whether that be for funding for land management through the program itself, or co-benefits such as carbon farming or tourism opportunities that can exist with a private conservation covenant. So Queensland's Private Protected Area program, it involves a binding permanent covenant that landholders voluntarily enter into and negotiate the conditions of with the state. There's two types. The vast majority are what are called nature refuges, and more recently there's a new class of private protected area introduced to Queensland called a special wildlife reserve, and special wildlife reserves have an even stronger level of protection, quite similar to what a national park would have. There's over 500 private protected areas in Queensland. It is the most successful in Australia private protected area program. And together they cover 4 million hectares of Queensland, and the vast majority of this is on pastoral leasehold land. The program does offer grant funding to landholders who participate for projects that improve land management and conservation values. So that may be things like off-stream watering, it may be fencing, it may be any activities that often have a benefit both for the grazing business and for the conservation values, whether it be keeping feral pests out of springs or waterholes or whatever it is. So the Queensland program, there's quite a diversity of landholders who are in it. So there's quite a lot of small landholders who are in the coastal hinterland who have lifestyle blocks with significant nature on them, who've entered into the program because they want to take care of it. There's also a lot of tourism ventures that have got now nature refuges on their properties. Cobalt Gorge is one of them. It supports their tourism aim and helps promote their tourist business, as well as their kind of land management goals. Also, Aboriginal organisations like Urman Aboriginal Corporation have nature refuges on their country, and also accessing tourism opportunities through that as well. But as I said, the vast majority of the landscape that's in a private protected area in Queensland is on pastoral land. The largest contributor to private protected areas in Queensland is MDH, McDonald Holdings, and with 3 of their properties, Mount Windsor, Rutland Plains, and Brightlands, and they've actually decided, I think, for the vast majority of their properties are declared as nature refuges, and they're permanent conservation areas. Collectively, I think MDH accounts for almost a million, I think 900,000 hectares of protected area, and that's internationally recognised as a protected area. I think Bob McDonald was particularly keen to get into the program as a legacy, and also to make sure that those valuable, beautiful, special landscapes remain protected forever. Another example of nature refuge landholders, Barry and Tammy Hughes from North Head Station. So Barry is now the Mayor of Etheridgeshire, and he's also the President of the Gulf Cattlemen's Association. And Barry describes his nature refuge on North Head as the feather in his cap. He believes it's a great way for graziers to be able to demonstrate that they really can lead the way in terms of conserving nature. I don't think you can get any more genuine than putting a permanent conservation covenant on your land to demonstrate your environmental credibility. So I'm also going to show, sorry, bear with me a sec. I will just show a little video of Gilberton Nature Refuge.
We're graziers, but we're really environmentalists. If we don't look after the country, it don't look after you. Gilberton is roughly 88,000 acres. We run beef cattle. We're not greenies, but we do love nature. But I think it's just the way you've grown up and you just love the environment around you and the birds and the bees and the lizards and everything else that comes with it. We did our first nature refuge in 2005 around one little spring, which was about 800 acres. And then in 2012, we did another one where we fenced off another main water contributor to the Gilbert River. And now we've just done the whole station as a nature refuge. The projects that we've done here on Gilbert and over the last, since 2005, with the nature refuge are things that we wouldn't have been able to do for another 30 years, simply because we couldn't afford it. So it's given us funding to pursue what we wanted to do to turn Gilberton into a drought-proof place, and at the same time we're looking after the country as we always have. I think if there was more investment from government side into nature refuge, I believe that through education between government and landholders, there would be more landholders that would go for it.
Right, so I think Lynn describes there the benefits of a nature refuge really well, and she mentions at the end there the importance of government investment, and that's kind of where we come in. We really do see private protected areas on pastoral land as a great opportunity for nature and for people, and we are working to advocate for better support from government for these programs so that we can really support landholders to be leading the way in private conservation in the rangelands. So in Queensland, called Our Living Outback, and we partner with landholders who are interested in conservation actions, as well as land management groups, and we advocate for increased public investment and support into the private protected area program. Nationally, Pew Charitable Trust is working across a number of areas. In South Australia, we successfully restored funding for conservation covenants, and we're now seeking to remove legal barriers to voluntary conservation on pastoral leases. In Western Australia, we've influenced policy to enable carbon farming, and we're now seeking to remove further legislative barriers to larger scale pastoral conservation. And federally, we're also advocating for investment into voluntary private land conservation with an aim of having at least 5% of the privately owned and managed land protected for future generations. So thank you for attending my talk.
Wonderful. Thank you, Riley Rocco from the Pew Foundation there for that fantastic presentation. What beautiful imagery and a great video there too.